If you stopped 100 people on the street and asked which volcano could do the most damage to the United States, almost every single one of them would say the same thing. Yellowstone, the supervolcano, the one that supposedly buries half the country in ash and ends life as we know it. It's the star of every disaster documentary and every doomsday headline. But here's the strange part. The people whose actual job is to track American volcanoes for a living don't spend much time worrying about Yellowstone. Their attention is fixed on a mountain that thousands of commuters glance at every morning without a second thought. Tens of thousands of people currently live, work, and raise families in the exact path of what this mountain does best. That mountain is Mount Rainier, and you'll understand why scientists consider it far more dangerous than the volcano everyone's actually scared of. Rainier towers more than 14,000 feet over Washington state, close enough to Seattle and Tacoma that office workers can see it. The U.S. Geological Survey has flagged it as one of the highest threat volcanoes in the entire country. But the twist in this story is that the thing which makes Rainier so lethal has almost nothing to do with a dramatic eruption. There's no requirement for lava, no mushroom cloud, no rumbling buildup. The disaster can begin on an ordinary sunny afternoon. So let's talk about why the volcano nobody fears might be the one we should actually be worried about. To see why Rainier gets overlooked, it helps to understand what actually makes Yellowstone famous. Yellowstone sits above a genuine supervolcano, a colossal underground reservoir of molten rock beneath the Wyoming wilderness. Its historical eruptions, which happened hundreds of thousands of years ago, blanketed much of the continent in ash on a scale that's almost impossible to visualize. That reputation is earned. But the scientists who monitor it stay calm for a simple reason. Yellowstone sits in the middle of sparsely populated wilderness, and the odds of a catastrophic eruption occurring within any human lifetime are vanishingly small. It's an enormous, sleeping giant that happens to live nowhere near anyone. Rainier is a completely different kind of problem, and the difference comes down to one word: location. Rainier doesn't sit in some remote corner of a national park. It looms directly above the edge of one of the fastest-growing metro regions in the Pacific Northwest. River valleys run straight from its glaciers down into towns, highways, ports, and neighborhoods. When you rank volcanoes not by the size of a hypothetical eruption, but by how many actual human lives are at stake, Rainier jumps straight to the top of the list, which is exactly why the USGS has given it one of the rare, very high threat classifications in the country. The reason a volcano even exists there in the first place goes back to plate tectonics. Off the Pacific coast, an oceanic plate is slowly diving beneath the edge of North America, and as it sinks into the hot interior of the Earth, it releases fluids that melt the rock above it. That molten material rises and has built an entire chain of volcanoes known as the Cascade Range. Mount St. Helens, Mount Baker, Mount Adams, Glacier Peak, and towering above all of them, Rainier. This machinery is still very much active today. Rainier isn't extinct, and it isn't dormant in any meaningful sense. It's simply been quiet for around 5 centuries, which sounds like forever to us, but is barely a blink for a volcano. Here's where the story stops being a geology lecture and starts getting genuinely unsettling. The danger with Rainier isn't really about fire, it's about ice sitting on top of rotten rock. Rainier is the most heavily glaciated peak in the lower 48 states, carrying roughly 24 major glaciers. In fact, it holds more snow and ice than every other Cascade volcano combined, more than 5 times as much. That ice looks like nothing more than scenery, but it's sitting directly above a heat source, which means even a modest melt could unleash a flood large enough to be catastrophic. Now for the trigger. What almost nobody realizes is that Rainier has been quietly rotting from the inside for thousands of years. Hot, acidic groundwater constantly circulates through the volcano's interior in a process geologists call hydrothermal alteration, and it slowly converts hard volcanic rock into soft, crumbly clay. You can actually smell evidence of this near the summit, where steam vents leak the unmistakable rotten egg odor of sulfur gas. Scientists who've mapped the mountain's interior have found that large sections, especially on the flanks facing the populated valleys, are made of this weakened, altered material. It's the geological equivalent of discovering that a skyscraper's support beams have quietly turned to chalk while the building still looks pristine from the street. Put those two ingredients together. A mountain nearly 3 vertical miles tall, carrying an enormous glacial load, with an interior slowly crumbling into mush, and you get the recipe for a collapse. When a chunk of a glacier-covered volcano gives way, it doesn't fall as dry rubble. It mixes instantly with ice and water and becomes something with a specific name, a lahar. If you remember one word from this entire video, make it that one, because a lahar is the actual killer hiding inside this story. Calling a lahar mud undersells it badly. It's a churning slurry of rock, ash, ice, and water that behaves like flowing wet concrete. It doesn't trickle or seep. It surges down valleys as a moving wall, tearing up trees, cars, bridges, and buildings and folding them into the flow. Past lahars off Rainier have moved at 45 to 50 miles an hour, and in narrow valleys they've stacked up to depths approaching 500 feet, taller than a 40-story building, moving at highway speed. And they don't stay the same size on the way down. As a lahar barrels through a valley, it scoops up loose soil, boulders, and river water, growing larger the farther it travels, a process scientists call bulking. The disaster that leaves the mountain isn't the disaster that arrives in town. It's bigger, denser, and far more destructive by the time it gets there. Because it's packed with rock and debris, a lahar can be several times denser than ordinary floodwater, which is why it doesn't behave like a flood at all. Houses aren't submerged. They're ripped off their foundations. There's no swimming through it and no riding it out indoors. The only strategy that has ever worked is not being there when it arrives. Here's the part that flips everyone's mental model of volcanoes upside down. We tend to assume eruptions come with warning, tremors, ash, some window where scientists can say, "Get out now." And often that's true. But a Rainier lahar doesn't need an eruption to happen at all. That weakened, clay-riddled rock can simply fail on its own, with no magma movement and no seismic signal that instruments can reliably catch in advance. The mountain can look exactly like a postcard one moment, and the next, a section of it is already racing toward the valleys. The USGS states this plainly. These landslide-triggered lahars can occur without warning. And we know this isn't theoretical because it's happened before, more than once, and at a scale that's hard to fully absorb. About 5,600 years ago, long before Seattle or Tacoma existed, a massive section of Rainier's upper flank collapsed in what geologists now call the Osceola mudflow. There's no clear sign an eruption caused it. The mountain appears to have simply given way. The resulting lahar poured more than 60 miles down the White River Valley, all the way to the shores of Puget Sound, reaching depths of around 100 feet, enough to bury a 10-story building. It didn't just cover the landscape, it permanently reshaped it, shoving rivers into new paths. In fact, the Rainier you see today is smaller than the mountain that existed before that collapse. A huge portion of the original summit tore away and became that flow. The serene white peak in every postcard is the scar left behind by that catastrophe. And the land the Osceola flow buried isn't empty wilderness. It's now home to well over 100,000 people living on top of the deposit without most of them ever knowing it's there. If that sounds like ancient history, consider this. Around the year 1500, only 5 centuries ago, Rainier did it again. This one, the electron mudflow, was smaller than the Osceola but still catastrophic. Again, with no evidence, an eruption triggered it. It surged roughly 34 miles down the Puyallup River Valley, spreading across about 13 square miles and piling up more than 25 feet deep in places. That flow came to rest almost exactly where the towns of Orting, Sumner, and Puyallup stand today. These aren't hypothetical hazard zones on a map. They're real towns with schools and grocery stores built directly on the hardened remains of a disaster from 500 years ago. Geologists have identified at least 9 major lahars reaching those lowlands over the last 5,600 years, averaging roughly one every 500 to 1,000 years. The last big one was about 500 years back, which means statistically we're not early in that window anymore. There's also a living memory example just up the road. In May of 1980, nearby Mount St. Helens erupted, and while most people remember the ash cloud and the sideways blast, some of the deadliest destruction actually came from the lahars, mudflows created when the eruption melted snow and ice, which then tore out bridges and buried homes for miles downstream. St. Helens is a relatively remote mountain, and its lahars still caused chaos. Rainier carries far more ice, sits much closer to far larger populations, and, as we've established, doesn't even need an eruption to set one off. To understand what this actually looks like when it hits a populated area, we have to leave Washington entirely and go to Colombia, to a night in November of 1985. A volcano called Nevado del Ruiz triggered a lahar that swept into the sleeping town of Armero, home to more than 20,000 people. In a matter of minutes, the town was gone, buried under mud, in roughly the time it takes to microwave dinner. It remains one of the deadliest volcanic disasters of the modern era, made worse by one brutal detail. Higher ground was often just a short distance away. Many of the people who died could have survived if they'd had the warning and the minutes to reach it. To scientists who study Rainier, Armero isn't a foreign tragedy. It's a preview, a dress rehearsal for the exact chain of events Rainier is built to produce, except the valleys below Rainier hold even more people than Armero ever did. So, who's actually standing in the path today? The town of Orting sits closest to the mountain, right where 2 of its most dangerous drainages meet, making it the single most exposed community. Downstream sit Sumner and Puyallup, then Auburn and Kent. all the way out to the busy port of Tacoma, threaded with highways, rail lines, and pipelines the whole region depends on. Added up, and the USGS estimates around 80,000 people currently live inside Rainier's Lahar hazard zones, alongside infrastructure that stretches far beyond Washington, one of the busiest container ports on the West Coast, interstate highways, and the arteries that keep goods moving in and out of the country. A large lahar wouldn't just be a local tragedy, it would sever supply chains for years, because once this mud settles, it hardens like concrete, and digging a buried town back out is a task almost too large to picture. Given all that, Washington has actually built one of the most sophisticated volcano warning systems on the planet. Since 1998, Pierce County Emergency Management has run the Mount Rainier Lahar warning system, which combines two things: buried acoustic sensors along the drainages that detect the distinct grinding rumble of a moving lahar, and a network of more than 40 sirens stretching from Orting down to Tacoma. When a lahar is detected, the sirens wail continuously, meaning exactly one thing: get to high ground now. Schools in these valleys run what's been called the largest lahar evacuation drill in the world, with thousands of students practicing the route from their classrooms to safety so often that, in theory, their bodies would know what to do even in a panic. But here's the brutal arithmetic underneath all that preparation. Current models suggest a large lahar could reach Orting in as little as 50 minutes, and for the towns closest to the mountain, the real evacuation window might only be 30 to 60 minutes. Sumner and Puyallup a little more, somewhere around 60 to 90. That's the entire margin between an ordinary afternoon and a mass casualty event, and it assumes everything works perfectly. Instant detection, instant sirens, everyone recognizing the sound instead of mistaking it for a monthly test, and thousands of people moving on foot at once without roads jamming. And remember, in the worst-case scenario, a spontaneous flank collapse with no eruption, the clock doesn't start when scientists notice trouble brewing. It starts the moment the mountain lets go, which the instruments may not catch until the mud is already moving. So, could this happen tomorrow? Right now, Rainier is quiet. The USGS watches it around the clock with seismometers, gas sensors, and GPS stations sensitive enough to detect the ground shifting by a fraction of an inch, and everything currently reads normal background activity. If magma ever starts moving toward the surface, there's a good chance instruments will catch it early. But that was never the scenario that worried scientists most. The spontaneous collapse of already weakened rock is the one that's already happened twice in the mountain's recent history, and it's the one that could give the least warning of all. Nobody can tell you if that's 1,000 years away or next year, and as the glaciers on Rainier retreat with a warming climate, they're exposing fresh, unstable slopes that geologists say are already producing more frequent small debris flows. He's a quiet reminder that this mountain isn't a static postcard. It's a living system that's still changing. Part of why this threat slips under the radar is simply how human attention works. We're wired to fear the sudden and the loud, a crash, a fire, an alarm, and we're bad at fearing the slow and the rare, even when the math says we shouldn't be. Yellowstone gets the magazine covers because its story is cinematic and world-ending. Rainier gets ignored because its story is quieter, more local, and, in the eyes of the people who actually study it, far more real. When you ask those scientists whether the next major lahar is a matter of if or when, they don't hedge, they say when. What nobody can hand you is a date. So, next time someone brings up Yellowstone as America's scariest volcano, you'll know the more honest answer. Yellowstone is a spectacular giant sleeping far from anyone who could get hurt. Rainier is a quiet, beautiful mountain standing directly over the homes of tens of thousands of people, capable of unleashing one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history without so much as a tremor to warn them first. The kids in Orting don't run drills for Yellowstone, they run them for the mountain right outside their classroom window, because the people who study it for a living have told them the truth. The most dangerous volcano in America isn't the one everyone's been watching. It's the one that looks like a postcard.